So in topics 8.6, we're going to look at biodiversity. And so really we're looking at how much life is living in a particular ecosystem and the different types of living things in that ecosystem. And we're going to look at what happens when we remove some of those and what different organisms play on that. So I just want to point out this statement that's written right here. The natural and artificial ecosystems with fewer component parts and with little diversity among the parts are often less resilient to changes in the environment. And that's because there's just not a lot of diversity. So biodiversity is a huge, huge factor in order of maintaining really strong, healthy ecosystems that can survive disasters. And so obviously there's some issues recently with limiting biodiversity. And there's some problems when we limit biodiversity in an area. So producer influence on biodiversity is if you increase, because they're at the bottom of the food chain, and if you increase producers and types of producers, then you'll see an increase in biodiversity. And we're going to actually see this when we talk about something down below in a trophic cascade, which is sort of a reverse of this situation, but you'll kind of see that. Another definition that we're just going to talk about briefly that can affect biodiversity is what we call a pioneer species. A pioneer species is an organism that creates habitats for other organisms to live in. And Mrs. Ronstadt's favorite example, because they're her favorite land aquatic animal, which is a very specific category of organisms, is the beavers. Beavers create dams, right? They build dams. And when they dam up a river or a stream, they create a pond. And that pond now can be a habitat for fish. It can be habitat for amphibians of all types. It can be a watering hole for different species of beaver, like deers and elk and moose can come into the watering hole. Birds use that lake for places of refuge and things like that. There's all kinds of other aquatic plants that can come in. And so you can get more producers and a different diversity of producers. So the beavers, by damming up a river or a river or stream and creating a pond, they can create an entire habitat that can now exist, and you can get all kinds of fun organisms that can come in there. And then another part of this is what we call a keystone species. A keystone species is a key species to the ecosystem. And just kind of like a little drawing of what we mean. If you're doing an arch, this is an archway. The keystone is this stone up at the top. And it's the thing that's holding the archway in place. If you remove it, the entire archway collapses. Very similar to what happens with a keystone species. So my example of this is going to be the sea otter. And a sea otter is actually a top predator. Well, it's not a top predator because it can be eaten by like sharks and orcas and things like that. But it's a higher up predator. A sea otter feeds mostly, oops, I drew my arrow the wrong way. Dear Pete. A sea otter feeds mostly on sea urchins, right? It goes down and it cracks them open and all that kind of stuff. And sea urchins feed mostly on kelp. And kelp is a huge habitat for all kinds of fish and crustaceans and bryozoan. There's all kinds of organisms that live in the kelp forest. It's a huge ecosystem that exists along our shorelines. So what happens is that eventually, like let's say we get rid of the sea otters because they're overhunted, okay? And that's what's happened. They have really wonderful pelts that keep them warm. So we eliminate the sea otter in this scenario. It's going to cause an explosion in my sea urchin population. Lots of sea urchins. And then what that's going to do is which leads to a wipeout. What am I writing? I'm just going to say no more kelp. No more kelp. Which actually also leads to no more kelp forest, which means all those organisms that lived in the kelp forest have to go somewhere else, or they have to find somewhere else to live because the sea urchins have eaten all the kelp. And so then there's no more kelp, so there's no more kelp forest. And so you've eliminated, by eliminating the sea otter, you've eliminated an entire ecosystem in many cases. And so the last part is a trophic, what we're going to call a trophic cascade. We're going to look at what happens when we're going to watch a video about trophic cascades when we reintroduce the wolves into Yellowstone. But I'm going to give you the fancy definition of this, and then we're going to watch an example in class. So an ecological phenomenon that is triggered by the addition or removal of top predators. And all the events that follow. And this will make sense when we look at what happens when they reintroduced wolves back into Yellowstone. So they added the wolves back into Yellowstone, and what happened to the entire ecosystem when we reintroduce this top predator. So I'm just going to put wolves in Yellowstone, and some of you might know that story. It's a really good story because it's a good example of humans doing the right thing. Okay, so there's a lot in there, and when we look at these complex ecosystems, but we'll get to see really good examples in class.